Is that good?
Yes.
Okay, good. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see this many people here. I was really prepared for a relatively empty room tonight, given that it's Halloween and several people had told me that they had to either take their children trick-or-treating or help their husband man the front door handing out candy. And then we had the rain. So I'm delighted that you all could make it here for our last session of this wonderful opportunity for me, anyway, and I hope it's been helpful and beneficial for you all, to talk about our minds and how important learning how to work with our minds is, because of how it affects the way we live our lives. So I think we'll start with a little bit of meditation practice. One of the things, I was speaking to some folks in the elevator coming up, one of the things we don't have time to do in a 2-hour session like this is actually have longer periods of meditation where we get a chance to really be with ourselves. And even at home, how many of you have been trying to do 10 minutes a day? How many of you have succeeded at doing 10 minutes a day? Okay, good. So trying to, succeeding at, that's good. Has anybody tried to do longer than 10 minutes a day? Good. So if we have, and I hope we will have some opportunities to have group gatherings like this where we have longer periods of time to sit together, because there is some kind of it's a kind of alchemy that happens when people actually sit together with the intention of waking up. Even the things that seem to be our obstacles can become stepping stones toward wakeful presence. And in particular, when we are supported by the fact that other people around us are also working with their minds in that way, then we can begin to notice our patterns more clearly and more quickly. So I don't want to say too much, but I do want to put up the basic meditation instruction. As you remember, posture, take your seat, comfortable, upright, relaxed. Choose a focus. We're working with our breath. Maintain open curiosity about what you notice. You don't need to judge. There is no good way, no bad way. Whenever you notice your attention has wandered, come back. Gentle persistence. Meditation is the continual act of making friends with yourself. So there's no need to give yourself a hard time about anything. Just pay attention and see what you notice. So let's do that for a few minutes. So Reeve and I talked this morning, and we thought we'd start a little differently tonight. We're going to start with journaling tonight. So how many people, is there anybody here who forgot to bring your journal? Okay, good. Then, Reeve, I'm going to turn it over to you here.
We don't need to get any journals, no?
No, I didn't see any hands go up. Oh, we have... Greg, could you bring a journal and a pen for Bill?
Well, happy Halloween. And thinking, just for the fun of it, to write a little bit about fear. Things we're afraid of, ghoulies and ghosties and long beasties and things that go bumping at night. Or not. And I'm thinking about this partly because, of course, it's Halloween, and because a member of a writing group I'm involved with here in St. Johnsbury wrote a little something and shared it with a group that I met with yesterday about the things he was afraid of as a child. And at that time, it had to do with what was living, who was the man living in the coal cellar, and that was pretty all-encompassing, really scary. And then some of us started thinking about just about other things we had been afraid of. And it's a fairly complex, or it can be very simple, the process of fear or what we're afraid of. And I don't think we need much time for this. I think Carol has things to talk about in terms of our fears. But the way we started in the group that this man recalled, some time ago we started with just saying, once I was afraid. And that may get you started. You may have another way of writing about fear. Once I used to be afraid of, or I am really afraid of, or you can start it any way you like. But something about fear for about 3 minutes would be great. I already turned that on, right? Yeah. Okay. So I don't know if anybody feels they have something they would be willing to share in what they've written or what they've been thinking. Anybody? No? Yeah. Joe.
Joe, one second. Take the mic, please.
Is this working? Yeah. Thank you. I just began writing some notes here. Let's see. Oh, I began actually a little earlier. I'll read it all. I have grown up by learning how to think without my mind getting too involved. All these pure white skeletons steal all the fear from me. On Halloween this year, hot chocolate and maple sugar candy. What a boon to find Main Street blocked off to walk through crowds of children dressed as God knows what, with parents watching carefully. This year, there is concern, if not a hint of fear, in the air. Crisp, cool night. After sleet and rain, today there could be awareness, more focused around a campfire. I'll walk my labyrinth sometime after writing this to dispel all fear tonight.
Thank you. That's very, very much right here.
Right out there.
Right out there, that's right. Not very far away from where we are here. Yeah, I had a little trouble, actually. I remembered what my friend had written about the coal cellar, but I wrote, I've been afraid of so many things. Wasps, loud noises, the dark, certain places in the basement of the house where I grew up, noises I don't understand at night, being alone with my thoughts sometimes, driving in Los Angeles, getting old, dying, losing people I love, getting lost, literally and metaphorically. More things, deeper ones, many of them about losses, I think. Quiet, quick, sharp fears, and quiet, aching ones. it felt to me as though there were different kinds of fear coming at me at different levels when I was sitting down and trying to write for these 3 minutes. And I may have been thinking that we would be talking about this, but I feel as if so often there are sort of fears that are formless that are just kind of there with me. And I sure hope some of you have fears, aside from Joe. You don't have to share them, but I hope you have them, because that would make me feel not so alone. Patton has something.
Well, I wrote down several examples, and they're each quite different.
Good.
One is speaking or performing in the presence of others.
I would never have guessed that.
Going for a doctor's appointment, because there's always the possibility that you're going to find out something.
You're going to find out something you did not want to know.
Not want to know, yes. Driving on a rainy night,
That's a good one.
pretty close here, and going to the dentist.
Yeah, got it.
You know, that's quite different from going to the doctor.
Yeah, it's a different thing. It's not what you're going to find out. It could be the actual experience.
Yeah, the actual experience.
Thank you.
I've got one. Once I was afraid lying in bed. My husband was there, snoring lightly, but suddenly I started to think, what would we do if someone broke into our house? Maybe there was a noise. I was sure it was the cat. I thought we would quietly lock the bedroom door, take our phones, lock ourselves in the bathroom, and call the police. And that reminded me the time when I was 11, and I locked myself and the little girl I was babysitting in the bathroom. It was to escape a neighbor boy, maybe 14, who had let himself in and had begun to chase me around the house.
Jeez.
The worst thing about it was that my mother didn't believe me when I told her about
She
it.
didn't believe you.
Yeah.
That's really scary.
Yeah. So actually, what I was thinking about, my husband and I locking ourselves in the bathroom, then I thought, no, I don't want to lock myself in the bathroom. We'll go out the attic. We'll climb up.
Upstairs, out the attic window?
Yeah.
That could also be scary.
I know, I kind of wrote at her, and then I started thinking about all those things. Anyway.
You can really get going. And I think that this past week or so, a lot of recent times, have been scary in a whole lot of ways and heartbreaking, especially just recently. And there I haven't so much felt fear. It's very, very present. Though almost wonderful, those people's faces, those lovely people's faces in Pittsburgh. And it doesn't bring me fear, it just makes me want to cry all the time. But fear seems to create some of what has been happening. At least I think it does. I think some people are afraid of each other, and I don't understand it at all. But there's a kind of floating fear that people seem to be suffering from and inflicting suffering on others. Anyway, I shouldn't be babbling away here, but I do think there's a lot of fear. And if you look inside, you find it, and some of it's from long ago, and some of it's just right around here. So I just would invite you to listen and take a look if you have those fears. I know I do. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so I had fun with this today. How to treat the trickster fear. Because fear actually is a trickster. Fear wears a lot of different masks. And one of the most useful things that we can do with our mindfulness practice is to use it to learn how to recognize fear underneath the many masks it wears, because if we learn to recognize it, then we can work with it. If we don't recognize it, we just project out onto the world around us. So fear can manifest as anger, despair, jealousy, greed. Basically, it can manifest as anything that we think of as something we want to get rid of. Because generally that's our response to fear in its many disguises, is we would like it to go away. Does that make sense to people? That's, whenever, like going to the doctor, and when they say, oh, all your tests are normal, then you're happy. If they say, well, there's something we're a little concerned about here, then you experience more fear, and you want to have whatever it is happen. I remember when, I hope you don't mind me using you as an example, Patton, but I remember going to the doctor when there was a question as to whether or not what you had was cancer. And they were going to do tests, and the doctor said, some people would just rather know they have cancer than have to live with the uncertainty. Because the fear of not knowing is in some ways harder than the fear of facing whatever it is that we now know we have to face. So I want to talk about this. So I want to talk about underneath the masks, what do we have? So under all these masks of anger, despair, jealousy, and everything, we find fear. And if we really look at it, if we really learn to recognize it and identify it, then we can begin to see that actually often under the fear is sadness. Sadness because basically we can't control our lives and we can't make things right for everybody around us. And that's hard. That's hard because we would like to. So we have fear of death, we have fear of loss, we have all of these kinds of different expressions of our longing to make things better in the world, and our desire not to have to feel what we feel when we can't make things better. So I think a lot of us are feeling this with regard to our society these days. So I want to talk about how we could work with fear as a practice in the same way that we work with mindfulness as a practice, that we work with contemplation as a practice, that we work with meditation and action as a practice. We can work with fear as a practice. So the first trick actually is that you have to get beneath the mask and recognize that what you're actually dealing with is fear. And often when you find yourself really angry, that's a good clue that if you sit down and spend a little time, you'll find fear under that anger. So if you can recognize that what you're experiencing is fear, then you can look for the fear feeling in your body. Some of us experience it as a tightening up. Some of us experience it as a rock in our stomach. Some of us experience it as a kind of trembling tentativeness. Everybody has, each of us have various ways that we experience fear. I mean, if you think about, one of the easiest ways to think about it is, what does your body feel like if somebody runs a stoplight in front of you? Instantly your body reacts. And so that's one kind of fear. But then there's also the kind of low-level nagging fear of, I think something may be wrong. I just got an email from my sister who lives in Mexico, and she flew up to the Bay Area because she was having a strange feeling in her chest. And she didn't trust that the doctors in Mexico would be able to actually accurately detect what was going on with her. And that's a whole different kind of fear. And you can find that in your body. You can feel, where do I feel that? It could be a low level, nagging kind of vibration, jitteriness. So you have to investigate. Nobody else can tell you how you find your fear, where you find your fear, how your fear expresses itself. But I remember I was teaching a program, Shambhala training. This area has had a big impact on my life because of karma choling. I moved here to live at karma choling in the 70s and started practicing meditation back in the mid-70s. And eventually I got very involved in a non-sectarian meditation program called Shambhala training that was presented to us by this Tibetan teacher who founded karma choling. And in that program, one of the main practices, this sort of second level that is presented in weekend programs, is about fear and fearlessness and how to work with what obstructs us, what keeps us from, we've talked a lot about wakeful presence, right? Does everybody have a sense of what that is? In the Shambhala training program, we talk about that as basic goodness. Basic goodness, because it's basically wholesome and good to be alive and awake and be able to pay attention and know that we are alive and awake and can pay attention. So what keeps us from being able to rest in wakeful presence all the time? Has anybody wondered that in your practice? Like, why do I keep spinning off? How come it's so hard to stay here? Anybody? Yes, okay. The reason is because we don't recognize fear and we don't want to feel fear. And because we don't want to feel fear, we generate a lot of activity that keeps us busy so that we don't have to feel our fear. Right? Does that make sense with your own experience? Anybody doesn't understand what I'm talking about? Okay, so if we can find the fear feeling in our body, then we can actually just stay present with that sensation. And then we go forward with fear as our companion. There's a fundamental underlying fear that haunts us from the time we understand death until we don't have any feelings anymore at all because we have met death. And that is, we realize how tenuous life is and how none of us know each day whether the next day will be given to us or not. So once you understand that, it makes sense that learning to go forward with fear as your companion is a sane way to live. Does that make sense? It's not easy to do, but it was my husband who pointed out to me at one point that the only difference between fear and excitement is the way you feel about it. And people go to amusement parks and haunted houses and scary movies because that deliberate incitement of fear makes us feel so alive, right? Suddenly we're just, this extreme experience gets our adrenaline pumping and we're awake and it feels like we're there. So it's possible to actually use our everyday fear that hides behind all these many masks as a way of enlivening and further energizing our wakeful presence. Does that make sense? It's a whole different perspective from what we're used to, which is, I'd like to get rid of this thing I don't want. I'd like to get rid of this thing I don't want, which is fear. I don't want to be afraid. I want to feel confident. Well, you can feel confident that you can rest in wakeful presence regardless of whether you're afraid or not. So that's what I wanted to say about fear. And with that in mind, it might be interesting for you to do a contemplation this week and go back and look at what you wrote down about what you're afraid of, and think about how you might work with that fear feeling and staying present and allowing it to actually energize you.
How do you do both? Watching the breath. I have a sense of it. That sounds very appealing to me. With all my big and little kinds of fear, but I can recognize it's fear, but they kind of come and go. But if you're in mindfulness practice for your 10 minutes or your half hour or whatever it might be, where do you put the fear feeling? How does that work?
Well, in mindfulness practice, when you're actually doing your formal sitting meditation practice, then you would just notice the fear, and you would probably label it. You could label it thinking, or you could label it sensation in your body, but you would return to the breath, because what you're doing in the mindfulness meditation practice itself is trying to strengthen your ability to direct and sustain your attention where you want it to be. So we don't want to go off into contemplation about our fear when we're actually trying to strengthen our mindfulness muscle. It would be as if you were working with your body and you were, say, doing weights with your arms, and suddenly you noticed that it was affecting the way your legs felt, and you just forgot about your arms and started working with your legs. You want to stay with the discipline. We're trying to learn how to work with the various elements of our experience in a way that strengthens our ability to choose how we live our lives. And so during the periods of time that you set aside for formal mindfulness meditation practice, you want to, whatever your object of meditation is, when we've been working with the breath, you want to return to that over and over and over and over again. No matter how brilliant the insight that arises in your mind may be, you want to come back to your breath, because that is what you're cultivating in that moment. But if, for example, in the middle of your mindfulness meditation practice, you suddenly have a strong insight about some fear that you have that you had not particularly noticed or paid attention to before, then you might choose to do you might choose to do mindful journaling about it. You might choose to do a contemplation where you ask yourself, what is that fear about? Now can I go deeper? Now can I go deeper? So it's all about just noticing your own experience and choosing what you're doing in any moment. But as you said so eloquently the first night, or maybe it was the second night after we had tried practicing that first week, and you said, it's all a jumble. It's all a jumble. So what we don't want to do is continue jumbling. So when you're doing mindfulness meditation practice, you want to come back to the breath. When you're doing journaling, you want to come back to what you're writing and how you want to put words on a page. When you're doing contemplation practice, you want to come back to wakeful presence and allow some space that insight can arise in about whatever the object that you're contemplating happens to be. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions about any of that? You look like you have something more to say.
No, I'm just kind of restating. So in a sense, you're bringing the skill that we hope to have acquired through the meditation, mindfulness practice. That same skill is coming into the daily round of our lives, and you have the fear feeling, or you have the sadness, and you say, fear.
There it is, right.
And you have a little. I loved that last time when we were looking at things, and I noticed there was a space when I could just see it, and I just absolutely could see it, and then I started thinking about whatever we were looking at. There is space, seems as if there's space.
There is.
When you suddenly know what you're thinking.
Right.
You say, oh, here comes that feeling again. But I don't do that in meditation. In mindfulness practice, I'm just trying to come back to the breath.
Trying to come back to the because when you try to come back to the breath again and again, you begin to develop a familiarity with that contrast between what it is to be caught and what it is to be present. And that familiarity with that contrast allows you to basically drop into wakeful presence. Once you've really become familiar, then it's like you recognize when you're standing in line at the grocery store and your mind is spinning about a dozen things, and then you recognize it, you can actually just stop. I'm going to talk more, 2 more flip sheets. I'm going to talk more about how we carry this forward into our lives. But yeah. Anybody else have any questions? Any comments, observations? Yes?
I just wanted to say that in my beginning mindfulness practice, which I have enjoyed thoroughly, what I wrote about tonight was I've always been afraid of anger. And that has come up over and over again in my practice. And I did a contemplative practice the other day with that information. And I got this message not to fix it.
Not to fix it.
Yeah. And that's the same as staying with it, right?
Absolutely. Yes. And that is exactly, thank you, that's a really good example of how the contemplation practice works with the meditation practice. If you don't develop that familiarity with wakeful presence, you won't be able to do the contemplation practice because the insight arises out of the space that comes from being able to rest in wakeful presence.
Right.
So when you can do that, then something pops up, and in your case, the something, told you, there it is, be with it. Anybody else? Okay. I think we'll do, it looks like maybe we're not going to get any more people here tonight, so I think maybe what we'll do is practice a little mindful communication. I've been thinking about how to take this into our lives and make the training that we're doing here something that actually impacts this world, because the more I pay attention, the more I realize how much this world needs people who are able to work with their own minds as opposed to projecting out their confusion into the world. So, I've been thinking about communication, mindful communication, and how it's the key to creating community. And I actually got out, well, I didn't get out the dictionary. That's an old-fashioned way of saying it. I looked it up on my computer. I used to get out the dictionary. I still keep the dictionary next to my desk because it makes me feel good to see it there, but I usually look things up online, and I looked up the etymology of communication and community because I thought, oh, they're bound to be from the same root word, which they are. And it is a Latin word, and it means public. And communion, indeed, comes from the same word. So what we have right now in our society is a breakdown of the inherent sympathetic human community that we actually evolved. We evolved in small tribes, right? I mean, that's how human beings evolved, in groups of a few dozen people, maybe up to 100, and we had the mirror neurons that developed in our brains developed to be sympathetic and reflect and be empathetic to our group, our tribe. But now we're in a much different social situation, and we have, I don't know if you remember, those of you that were here for the first night, but I talked about how our brains get hacked. Why should we practice mindfulness? So that we can know when we're being hacked. And if you know when you're being hacked, then you don't have to be hacked. So right now, there is I don't know how organized and concerted it is, but there is certainly an effort to pit people against one another that is being propagated by both mainstream media and social media. And every time we get solidly behind one extreme or the other, we view those people at the other extreme as demons, enemies, at best confused, at worst evil. If we want to have a sense of community in our world, which is actually what will create a wholesome environment that allows us to productively address the problems we need to address, that we can't address if we are polarized, then we need to learn how to communicate with one another. And so learning to listen mindfully is the key to creating community. It's not learning to express yourself more articulately, much as we might like that to be the case. Are we reverberating? Okay. Is that better? Okay. So, learning to listen mindfully. First step is to stow your storyline. Where whatever situation it's in, if you come into it already certain that you know where that person's coming from, what the situation is, how things should be, you have closed so many doors already. You've got your storyline, and it does not leave any space for any insight or intelligence or communication to occur. Does that make sense? So, stowing your storyline, stop and drop into wakeful presence. So if you, let's say you are about to have, I talked in one of the last sessions about contemplation practice and how I had this idea that I was going to call this person up and give them a piece of my mind. And then I did a contemplation practice, and I ended up, after the 3 steps of the contemplation practice, I ended up with the insight that I should be inquisitive about what this person wants from me. So I'd already done a good bit of work by the time I got to that, but if I started into that conversation with the idea that I had a pretty good idea what that person wanted from me, then I would not be likely to get what that person really might want from me. So it's dropping your preconceptions, basically. Drop your preconceptions. Stow your storyline. Stop and drop into wakeful presence. Open ears and mind. And you know the two have to work together. Because if you're... How many times have you had the experience where somebody's talking to you and you realize that you didn't hear the last things they said, right? Everybody had that experience. How many times have you been talking to someone and you realize they aren't hearing what you're saying? Probably easier to notice that one. You have to open your eyes, your ears, and your mind at the same time. And then you hear, And you're actually taking in. You're actually allowing new information in. Somebody, and I can't remember who it is, said that when you talk, you don't learn anything new. When you listen, there's the off chance you might. So open your ears and your mind, and part of the way you do that is by seeing the patterns that arise within you and letting them go. So when somebody says something and it immediately pushes your button and you're ready to think about how you're going to respond to that person, you could notice that and drop it. And just open your ears and your mind again. This is really challenging work. But it's absolutely necessary if we are going to communicate across political positions, basically. We have to be able to not immediately solidify our position, but open and hear. Because if you really do this, well, let me go to the next one. Really listen. So you listen within yourself. That's how you notice your patterns. And then listen to what you're hearing outside of yourself and really listen. Setting aside your reactions and your judgments, really listen. Because if you really listen, I promise you that most of the time, what you will hear is, to go back to the last sheet, you will hear that people are talking about what they're afraid of. And if you can recognize that what manifests overtly as aggression and hatred actually arises out of people's fear, you will be more skillful in dealing with that person. So, finally, speak clearly and kindly, telling the truth and appreciating our commonality. And I don't know if you remember, but from the first class, one of the things when I put up the ways in which training our mind benefits us personally and the ways in which it benefits us as a society, one of the things was that we come to appreciate our commonality. We all want a better world. We just have different ideas about how we get there, what that is and how we get there. And we cannot get rid of the people who don't agree with us. That has been tried and it doesn't work well. So we have to find another way. And I think the way is through communication. So let's take about 20 minutes, and I'd like to ask everybody here to, if you're sitting next to your, if you're sitting next to your spouse or your best friend, look a little further afield. I'd like to ask everybody here to just pair up for a moment with somebody that you don't know, and I'm going to give some instructions. But first, let's go ahead and pair up.
Somebody I don't know.
Is there anybody here you don't know, Reeve? And if you know everybody here, then just pair up with some. So we're going to talk quietly, one-on-one. So I just want you to pair up. Okay, I think Patton, there were a couple of people who left. I bet one of them will come back. Yeah, Patton doesn't, but I think. Does everybody have a partner except Patton? You can talk to me, but I said spouse. A couple of people went down the stairs. Yeah. Mr. Videographer, could we recruit you for just a minute? Are you willing to be recruited, or do you need to be doing things with the camera? He's good. Okay, you're all done. Okay, Pat, have a seat. You and I will do this later. Okay. So now, because we're in such close quarters here, you're going to have to lean in and speak quietly to one another. But this is the exercise I want you to do. I'd like you to think. I'm going to ring the bell. We're going to take a moment of silence. Well, somebody's going to go first. Decide who in your group is going to speak first. Just look at each other and pick. Both of you are going to speak, so it doesn't really matter whether you go first or not. Okay, I'm going to ring the bell. When I ring the bell, whoever's going to go first, I would like you to think of a situation that you are working with in your life right now. It could be something you've done some contemplation practice about. It could be something at work. It could be something with your health. Anything. It doesn't matter. And you can share as much or as little of that as you want. But I would like you to try to speak sort of from the space of wakeful presence. Speak your truth about that situation. This is what it is. You're going to have 2 minutes. And believe me, 2 minutes may feel like a long time. But if you really get into it, it's going to feel like a very short time. But so that's what the speaker's going to do. The listener, this is the really important part. The listener is going to just listen. To the best of your ability, do not nod your head. Do not give confirmation. Do not do not ask questions. Do not do anything except actually listen. See if you can do that. I will tell you right now, you will not believe how hard that is. But that's fine. What we're trying to do is learn how to recognize these patterns. So watch your patterns and how you want to jump in and respond to the person. Okay, then at the end of the 2 minutes, when the first person is through talking, I'll ring the bell, and we'll have a moment of just allowing some space, and then you'll have 1 minute to say anything that arose within you that feels like it is telling the truth and appreciating your commonality. The second person will be responding to the first person. And so you'll have 1 minute to do that, and then the listener will be responding to the speaker. So I'll ring the bell, we'll settle, I'll ring the bell again, the speaker will start speaking. Number one will start speaking. You'll have 2 minutes to speak, and then I will ring the bell again, and we'll have a moment of space, and then I'll ring the bell again, and the listener will have a minute to speak your truth of what you heard. That's the point at which, if you have some advice to offer or some place where it resonates with your experience, then you say that then. And then after a minute, I'll ring the bell. We'll have another moment of settling and space, and then I'll ring the bell again, and you'll switch roles, and the second person will be the speaker. Is that clear? People understand what we're doing? Yes. Any questions? Okay. All right. So if you're real close to another pair of people, you might want to pull your chairs apart just a little bit or something. Yeah, you can sit and listen if you want. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just settle And then when I ring the bell for the second time, then speaker number 1 starts to speak. So relax and rest in wakeful presence for just a moment. Allow yourself to settle. And now, if you were the listener, you can respond. Okay, let's settle, and now we're going to switch roles. So let's take a moment to just settle. Okay, so let's settle a little bit. We'll have to do the best we could. I should have just turned it off. Okay, so we'll settle, and then some responses from the listener. Okay, response. I would be really interested in anything that you care to share about your experience of being either the speaker or the listener or both. Yes.
I found being a listener, it was very hard not to nod, like I'm hearing you, like not to get any input that I was hearing.
Mm-hmm.
That was hard for me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is hard. That is. We're actually hardwired not to be completely expressionless. We're hardwired to express our empathy. So it's an interesting thing to try not to and see how that feels, how we bump up against the edge of our natural empathy. Anybody else? Yes.
I love the experience. Meeting Beth was such a joy, and I love the listening part. And I don't know if I was totally blank faced, but I was really with her, and it felt so nice.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't really like being the talker so much, but fortunately, it's short, so I don't have to think about it.
Yes,
But
yes.
it was a beautiful experience, and I not only heard her words, I felt her words, and that was a beautiful experience.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you. Thank you. Mary Liz.
I want to say the same thing almost. I really did find out.
Why are we getting feedback off that mic?
Maybe I'll try this. Can you hear me? Yeah. I really did feel that, how much
Mary Liz, don't do that. We can't hear on the camera if you do that.
Yeah, that's why there we go. That's
Just
what.
don't speak right into it. Hold it down a little bit.
Okay.
There we go.
Still, I forgot what I was going to say.
You said you really did have the same experience.
The listening, you know me, and other people are getting to know me. I talk a lot, and I'm realizing what I missed. Or to put it another way, I realized what I got. It wasn't the words. It was the feeling, it was the emotion, it was all I found out that that was something I was missing. And trying to be blank, which is very hard for me to be, and is, of course, not really what you're trying to do, but anyway. It came through on another level. What she was saying, I heard it in a different way. And I wasn't breaking the rules. I really had to ask her what she said because, I don't always hear.
Right, if you don't hear, that's
why
one thing. No. Did other people have that experience that you heard, that you, as you were the listener, that you heard in a different way? Reeve?
I definitely think I heard in a different way.
Yeah, it is.
Well, okay, but also that because I did not know the person who was talking to me, I didn't have any idea what she would be saying, and I was very much interested in what she had to say, and I could not help smiling or doing something that went out, but I tried to put my head down so she couldn't see me. But it was a real gift to be listening so closely. It was different from the way I think you realize. I don't think we normally are in a situation where someone is talking to you for 2 minutes
And you're not.
quite intensely, and you're just not doing anything else but listening.
Right.
I don't think we're often in that situation. But I too felt I must miss so much. There must be so much that I miss in conversation, and I don't even know.
Yes. It's this, in a way, if we had longer, if we were doing more than these 2-hour sessions and had longer, we would do this for a longer period of time. So you'd have like maybe 5 minutes to say whatever you wanted to say. And there are a couple of interesting things that happen when that happens. As the speaker, you don't feel like you have to get everything out in a hurry before you're interrupted or it's not your turn to talk anymore. You have some space to take your time and articulate. And as the listener, you realize that, just as you said, that how much you miss when you are constantly feeling like you have to give the feedback right away or you have to respond right away or whatever. So it's a very interesting thing. Did I see a hand? Somebody else? Yes.
There was just another whole third part of that. For me to hear myself speak for 2 minutes was amazing, and I felt I totally had the attention of my partner, that was incredible. I mean, that was a gift to myself, to hear myself say things that I thought I really never said to anybody else. Even if it was only 2 minutes, it seemed like a long time.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, yes.
I just find that when I'm in normal conversation with people and people are saying their stuff, it's like everybody just wants to talk about themselves. So nobody's really listening because when it's our turn, we just talk about ourselves and we don't really talk about what we heard the other person say. So, doing this kind of exercise, you do get to focus on the other person and not say, okay, now the conversation's about me.
That reminds me of the time I blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a very interesting thing. It also is a way of cultivating generosity, because one of the greatest gifts we can give any human being is our full attention. And when someone bestows their full attention on you, you feel it. You feel enriched by that. And then having the opportunity to pay full attention to somebody, to actually give them something in return, which is your reaction, your response, your engagement with whatever it is they offered to you. It's a very interesting practice. And it's not that we're suggesting that you do this in your everyday, ordinary conversations with everybody, just like we don't suggest that you go around following your breath all the time. this is a practice that we do to actually notice how our communication becomes habituated and what it feels like when we interrupt that habituation with an exercise that forces us to communicate in a different way. Does that make sense? Good. Anything else anybody wants to share or about this?
I just wanted to say how much I appreciated the eye contact.
The eye contact. Yeah.
We did it fast.
Yeah, good. Good.
And that wasn't easy because I was her partner and I was reading her lips. And I felt because I can't hear her.
Right.
And I felt the lack of contact if I didn't try to hold eye contact.
Well, you must have held it well enough that she appreciated it, so there you go.
So much.
Yeah, good, good. Okay, good. Thank you. So I would like to, we have, I was saying tonight in the car as we were driving here, my friend Bill Brower, who is on the board of Applied Mindfulness Training, was not able to attend before tonight, but he came and he said, so are you sad this is over with? And this is the last night. And I said, it reminds me of something that another friend said a long time ago about a program that we'd done together. And he said, you wait so long, it takes so long to get here, and then it's over so quickly. And I remember sitting over at the Hilltopper last spring at lunch with Bob Jolly, talking about applied mindfulness training and the possibility that we might offer something here at the Athenaeum, and Bob was quite enthusiastic about it, and I said he would try to get us sponsors. The reason this is, the Athenaeum does not charge for people to attend here, as you know, but when people do things here, if they're paid by sponsorships that the Athenaeum solicits for this. So Bob said, I'll try to get some sponsors and we'll try to make this thing happen. And Bob has not been able to be with us because of other obligations that he has with his work, but those of you who know him, be sure to tell him how much you appreciate that he did this, and I will tell him the same thing. We're looking at how to go forward now. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about taking this into your everyday life. And then I also have some feedback sheets that I'm going to hand out tonight, which I would like to ask you to take just a couple of minutes and fill out and give back to us, because we this is an experiment, actually. This is the first time that we have done this in this way, and I'm really interested in how it feels to you and what has worked, and if there's anything that hasn't worked, and any suggestions you might have or whatever. So let me, before we do that, and then a couple of people asked me if you could buy a book, so we will be selling books, and there'll be brochures over there for applied mindfulness training afterwards, and you can drop your feedback sheets off over at that table. So going forward, again, I want to come back to the three kinds of practice that we have been talking about. So, daily sitting meditation, cultivate confidence in your ability to rest in wakeful presence. That is the single most important thing you can do in training your mind. The meditation practice of coming back to the breath again and again and again, it's not so we can follow our breath. That is not the point. The point is that as we develop the facility of being able to come back and recognizing when we are caught up in our thoughts and recognizing when the break happens and being able to come back, as soon as that break happens, you're already back and you can just rest. You can just rest and return to the breath. So that is wakeful presence. And the more you do it, the more you realize that it's always possible. And when that's really valuable is when you're in the middle of a situation in the midst of life and somebody really pushes your buttons and you're about to react. And it's really helpful at that point to have confidence that you can rest in wakeful presence. So we'll get to that down here. But in the midst of busyness and confusion, and in particular confusion where you have an issue and you aren't quite sure how to approach it, what to do with it, how to work with it, then you can clear a space to practice contemplation. It's different from the basic meditation practice. It's a way of harnessing the power of your conceptual mind to work with creating the space for insight to arise about whatever it is that you have as an issue at that point. And then finally, even when you can't clear any temporal or physical space, you right jam up in the middle of everyday life, you can always practice meditation in action. And my favorite way of thinking about that is what they teach kids in school. If you're ever on fire, stop, drop, and roll. So stop means as soon as you notice that you're caught up, you've actually already stopped, right? That noticing is stopping. So you notice, then you can drop into wakeful presence, and then you just roll. You just do whatever it is that's in front of you to do. But if you remember this, when you're in the heat of the moment, that helps. It's instructions for when you're on fire. When you're in the heat of the moment, you can stop, drop, and roll. So, does anybody have any questions about any of that?
What's roll?
Roll is that you step into the next moment, doing whatever it is the moment calls for. If you stop and drop, you will be able to see more clearly what will bring benefit in that moment. If you remember back to the first class when I talked about applying mindfulness allows us to learn to direct our attention, detect patterns, and deliver benefit. So if you want to deliver benefit, you actually have to interrupt the momentum of your conditioning so that you can see what will really bring benefit. And a lot of times it isn't what our conditioned reaction would be. In fact, most times it isn't. It's always, always beneficial to create some space in the situation, always. So even if the only space you can create is just to pause and take a deep breath and then roll into the next moment, that's what you do. Any other questions? Anybody have any? Yes?
I was just going to say, a great time to do this is at red lights.
Sorry.
So what I do is I'll get to a red light and there might be 15 or 20 seconds just to close my eyes and just be present.
Yes.
And I find that the guy behind me always lets me know my but it's a great time to do it. So.
Right, good, yes. The guy behind you is not stopping, dropping, and rolling. He's ready to get through that light. Yeah. That again reminds me that, this meditation in action, there are two different ways that meditation in action happens. If you remember when I first introduced it, I talked about you can choose certain times of the day that you want to do it, like brushing your teeth, or making your coffee, or walking to the water fountain at work, or waiting, red light, or waiting for your kids at the bus stop, or whatever it might be. You can choose to select certain times that you decide not to just be habitual, but to actually try to exercise your ability to be present. And you choose those times. Then there's the spontaneous meditation in action that occurs whenever you realize that you're caught up. The momentum is rolling and suddenly you realize, whew, I'm really into this. And you realize the benefit of actually recognizing that and taking a moment to create some space. Does that make sense? Okay, any other questions, comments, observations, anything? Patton.
I was was thinking about just my own work history, which involved a lot of negotiating, where you were sitting around the table with a number of people. And since I was a lawyer, I was representing the client. But if you're in a situation where you're the principal, you can do the same thing. But knowing what you need to do and being able to listen to what the other person has to say, you may, if you're just reactive, then you may actually miss an opportunity. Whereas if you can just listen and hear what the person says, sometimes it's a matter of their tone of voice. It's very interesting. That's meditation in action.
Yes.
Is being there and doing it.
Yes.
Doing it that way so that you can be effective.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? Reeve?
This is more of a comment. And you reminded me when you were talking about all the ways we listen or don't listen, that when I was teaching second grade and the kids put their hands up and the whole group would put their hands up and you choose somebody to speak and the other kids still had their hands up. And I finally said, you can't hear when your hand is up in the air. And they all go down. But it's sort of true. If you're just there with what you want to say, that's what happens.
Right, and I think that's one of the things that as we become more and more aware of what's going on within us and around us, as we become more aware of the patterns, we begin to realize just how much we and other people around us are missing because we're so full of thinking about the next thing, whatever that next thing is that we want to say or do or respond or whatever. And so, that ability to take a break from that constant strategizing about the next moment, which is what we do so much, to take a break from that, just that in itself allows greater intelligence to surface. Good. Okay, so I would like to, at this point, Greg, would you hand out I just want to ask you to take a couple of minutes and fill out these feedback sheets for us, please. Because this is Halloween and we've lost like half of the people that have been here for most of this program, we're also, when I send out the notes from this last class, there'll be a link to a comment sheet there too for those people to fill out. And if you think of anything that you wished you'd said or would like to communicate with us, you can fill out the online form as well. But I'd really like to get some feedback from you all tonight. I'd also like to just ask, as we're doing this, for a show of hands of how many people would be interested in having some kind of ongoing opportunity to practice together and discuss and maybe meet and have longer periods of meditation. How many people would be interested in that? Okay, good. There's a good bit of interest. So we have all your email. If you haven't been getting the emails from me each week, be sure to give me your email address tonight. But if you have been getting them, then you're on the list, and I will be sending out something with some possible suggestions about what we might do to maintain the momentum of this. Because the big challenge is to keep going. And especially if you don't have the support of a group and, oh, it's Wednesday night, let's go to the mindfulness class, it's easy for it to fall off your radar and you get back into your everyday patterns and you forget about it. So we would like for that not to happen. We would like to keep this on your radar and at least on the back burner in your life. So I think we will end with this writing and meditation. So I'm going to just ring the bell, and you fill out your feedback sheet, and when you're through filling out your feedback sheet, let's just sit together for the last part of the class. Why is this thing doing that? So I have a few thank yous and a couple of other things I want to say. Again, I want to thank, is Scott still over there? Yes. Scott, please convey to the rest of the Athenaeum staff our great appreciation for hosting this. This has been really a wonderful place to do this, and wonderful to have this opportunity. I'd really like to thank my dear friend Reeve, who brings so much heart to everything she does. And when I thought about this program and I thought about what I'd like it to be, I knew that I wanted Reeve to contribute her wisdom about using writing to help us navigate our paths as human beings. Our dear friends, Greg McNally and Canlin Dobbs, who've been handling the details, thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to have you here. And to all of you, I'm really actually extraordinarily touched and impressed at your exertion and your generosity in showing up and participating, and it gives me, it's very heartening to see how people are so willing to work to have a better life and to make a better world. And I think that the tools that we've been working with here are sorely needed in this world. And if this could be